In this video, we will be talking about how stress affects the immune system. There are individualized cumulative amounts of stressors that exist in an individual's life and that influence his or her physiologic responses. Environmental stressors, life events, and physical stimuli are interpreted by the brain. Stressors produce a behavioral response that leads to a physiologic response. Both the behavioral response and physiological response are influenced by individual differences. If the behavior and physiologic responses reduce the influence of the stressor, it leads to adaptation and a return to homeostasis. If the responses are not adaptive, the stressor contributes to the person's overall allostatic load. The parasympathetic system is heavily involved in the process of adaptation. It opposes the stress response caused by the sympathetic nervous system and exerts an anti-inflammatory effect on damaged tissue. Activity of the parasympathetic nervous system decreases when exposed to chronic stress. This allows the sympathetic nervous system to be unopposed and results in maladaptation, an exaggerated stress response, and an increased allostatic load. The body may become overwhelmed if the allostatic load becomes too large. This leads to allostatic overload. Allostatic overload occurs when the body's compensatory mechanisms break down and the body begins an exaggerated and amplified response to stressors. Allostatic overload leads to disease, impaired immune response, heart failure, kidney failure, or even death. The brain is influential in determining when allostatic overload has been reached. Chronically elevated levels of catecholamines and cortisol predispose to illness. The release of the stress mediators are no longer adaptive, but maladaptive and damaging, and this can influence central nervous system functioning, metabolism, cardiovascular function, and also immune function. Psychologic stress may also exacerbate or worsen several disease states. Stress is related to the severity of symptoms and the outcomes of diseases and conditions. Chronic diseases such as hypertension, autoimmune disorders, asthma, diabetes, irritable bowel disease, and HIV get worse with stress. Additionally, wounds, cuts, and lacerations, and other injuries to the body take longer to heal. Finally, immunizations are not as effective. Chronic stimulation of the central nervous system by cortisol and catecholamines results in fatigue and lethargy due to protein catabolism. The person may have difficulty with concentration and memory. They may develop depression, anxiety, and insomnia due to decreased activity of serotonin and dopamine transmitters. Long-term activation of the central nervous system by the stress mediators can result in increased aging effects, development of diabetes, and Alzheimer's. Cortisol is heavily involved in the development of metabolic syndrome, obesity, and diabetes in those who are genetically predisposed. Obesity occurs because cortisol induces lipogenesis, or fat deposition, in the abdomen, trunk, and face. At the same time, fat is broken down in other tissues in a process called lipolysis. This pattern of fat deposition is called central obesity and carries high risk of cardiovascular disease. Cortisol is also heavily involved in the development of diabetes. Cortisol promotes the development of diabetes in those people who are genetically susceptible. Generally, diabetes is secondary to cortisol-induced obesity. Cortisol and the catecholamines antagonize insulin. This means that they block the receptors that insulin normally binds to. This antagonization prevents insulin from stimulating cellular intake of glucose, or insulin resistance. The blood sugar gets higher as insulin resistance develops. Other effects of cortisol include the creation of free fatty acids, insulin resistance and hyperglycemia, reactive oxygen species, and pro-inflammatory cytokines also contribute to the development of diabetes. The stress hormones also significantly affect the cardiovascular system. The sympathetic nervous system increases the blood pressure. Increased levels of inflammatory cytokines result in increased inflammation, which is an important component in developing cardiovascular disease. Then also stress results in the lysis of fatty acids, which increases serum lipids, and hyperglycemia is increased, as mentioned in the previous slides. Catecholamines and cortisol are insulin antagonists, and this leads to increased blood sugars in the body. Many studies have linked psychological distress with altered immune function, and evidence strengthens the association of stress with the potential for illness in humans. Cortisol's effect on the immune system is concentration and location dependent and may include either stimulation or inhibition of the immune system. For inflammation, cortisol results in increased levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, which results in acute inflammation and increased allergic reactions. Cortisol suppresses T helper 1 activity, which decreases the natural killer cell and T cell cytotoxicity, decreased ability to fight viral infection, and decreased ability to identify and eradicate cancer cells. Finally, cortisol also stimulates T helper 2 activity, which enhances humoral or antibiotic immunity, and this leads to more risk of autoimmune diseases and increased hypersensitivities. Stress influences the functioning of the reproductive system, inhibits both luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, which are involved in ovulation. It also inhibits estradiol, which is involved with menses and pregnancy. It also produces resistance to estradiol in estradiol's target tissues. On the male side of things, testosterone is also suppressed by stress. Testosterone regulates the male secondary sex characteristics and also libido. With aging, sometimes a set of neurohormonal and immune alterations develop. These changes have been defined recently as the stress age syndrome. These stress-related alterations of aging can influence the course of developing stress reactions and lower adaptive reserves and coping. Components of this stress age syndrome include excitability changes in the limbic system and hypothalamus, which results in increased release of catecholamines, antidiuretic hormone, ACTH, and also cortisol. It results in decreased testosterone, thyroxine, and many other hormones. Alterations of opioid peptides, immunodepression, alterations in lipoproteins, hypocoagulation of the blood, free radical damage of cells, development of stress reactions, and finally lowers the adaptive reserve and coping mechanisms of the elderly. And this brings us to the end of the stress and disease lecture. Again, would like to just end with a short question just to review some of the things we've covered. The answer will be on the next slide.